The smell of fresh apple pie filled the cozy dining room as Margaret set the table for what she thought would be another peaceful Sunday dinner with her son David and his wife Sarah. The autumn leaves were dancing outside the window of the house she had called home for 37 years, the same house where she had raised David as a single mother after his father left when he was just 5 years old. Margaret had worked 2 jobs most of those years, cleaning offices at night and working at the local diner during the day, all to keep this roof over their heads and food on their table. Every payment, every repair, every memory was woven into these walls with her blood, sweat, and tears. Hello, my dear friends. I'm Tina, and I'm here with you today as your trusted companion in these moments when we need to share stories that touch our hearts deeply. You know, sometimes life presents us with situations that test not just our patience, but our very understanding of family bonds and what we truly deserve. Today, I want to share with you a story that will make you question everything you thought you knew about sacrifice, respect, and the power of standing up for yourself when those closest to you cross every line. This is a story about Margaret, a woman who gave everything for her family, only to discover that sometimes the people we love most can be the ones who hurt us deepest. Stay with me until the end, because what Margaret does will absolutely shock you, and I guarantee it will leave you thinking about your own relationships in a completely different way. If you're someone who believes in justice and standing up for what's right, please hit that like button and subscribe to join our family of strong, supportive souls. Margaret had always been proud of David's success. After graduating from law school, he had quickly climbed the corporate ladder at a prestigious firm downtown, married Sarah, a woman from a wealthy family, and they now lived in a magnificent house in the most exclusive neighborhood of the city. But over the past 2 years, Margaret had begun to notice subtle changes in her son's behavior. The warm hugs had become brief, obligatory embraces. The phone calls that once lasted hours were now rushed conversations that ended with David claiming he had important meetings to attend. And Sarah, well, Sarah had never particularly warmed up to Margaret, but lately her cold politeness had evolved into something that felt more like barely concealed disdain. As Margaret placed the last fork on the table, she heard David's expensive car pulling into the driveway. Through the window, she watched her son emerge from his BMW, adjusting his expensive suit and checking his Rolex with the same impatient gesture she had seen him make countless times recently. Sarah followed behind him, her designer heels clicking against the concrete, her face wearing that practiced smile that never quite reached her eyes. Margaret took a deep breath, smoothed down her simple blue dress, the same one she had worn to David's graduation, and walked to the door to greet them. "Mom," David said, giving her that brief hug she had grown accustomed to. "We need to talk after dinner. It's important." There was something in his tone, something cold and businesslike, that made Margaret's stomach tighten with an inexplicable sense of dread. Sarah barely acknowledged her presence, walking straight into the living room and settling into the armchair as if she owned the place, immediately pulling out her phone and scrolling through what Margaret assumed were social media posts from her wealthy friends. During dinner, the conversation was stilted and uncomfortable. Margaret tried her best to engage them, asking about David's latest cases, about their recent vacation to Europe, about Sarah's volunteer work at the country club. But every attempt at connection was met with short, disinterested responses. David kept checking his watch, and Sarah made several comments about how quaint and outdated everything in the house looked. When Margaret proudly mentioned that she had finally finished paying off the mortgage the previous month, after 37 years of careful budgeting and sacrifice, she expected some acknowledgement, some recognition of this milestone achievement. Instead, David and Sarah exchanged a meaningful look that made Margaret's blood run cold. After dessert, David cleared his throat and assumed what Margaret recognized as his lawyer voice, the one he used when delivering bad news to clients. "Mom, we've been thinking about your situation here," he began, gesturing around the modest but well-maintained living room. "This house is way too big for just you, and frankly, it's not in the best neighborhood anymore. Sarah and I have been discussing it, and we think it's time for you to sell this place and move into one of those nice senior communities. You know, where you'd have people your own age around, activities, medical care nearby. Sarah nodded approvingly, finally looking up from her phone to add, "It would be so much more appropriate for someone in your stage of life, Margaret." Margaret felt as if someone had poured ice water through her veins. "My stage of life?" she repeated slowly, trying to process what she was hearing. "David, this is my home. This is where I raised you, where all our memories are. I just paid off the mortgage. Why would I want to leave?" David's expression hardened, and for a moment, Margaret saw a stranger sitting at her dining table, someone cold and calculating who bore only a physical resemblance to the little boy she had rocked to sleep countless nights. "Mom, you're being emotional about this," David said dismissively. "We're talking about practical matters here. The money from selling this house would set you up comfortably for the rest of your life. You could live in a nice facility, have everything taken care of, and Sarah and I wouldn't have to worry about you being alone out here." The words hit Margaret like physical blows. Worry about her? When was the last time either of them had called just to check on her? When was the last time they had visited without wanting something? Sarah leaned forward in her chair, her manicured nails drumming against the armrest as she prepared to deliver what Margaret would later realize was the crushing blow they had planned all along. "Margaret, we need to be honest with you about something else," Sarah began, her voice taking on that patronizing tone that wealthy people often use when they think they're being generous. "David and I have been looking at some investment opportunities, and frankly, we could really use the capital that this house would provide. We found this amazing property upstate, perfect for our future children, but we need a substantial down payment. Selling this place would solve everyone's problems." Margaret stared at her daughter-in-law, trying to comprehend the audacity of what she had just heard. "You want me to sell my house so you can buy another one?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. David shifted uncomfortably in his chair, unable to meet his mother's eyes as Sarah continued with her calculated speech. "Think about it rationally, Margaret. You'd be helping your family secure their future while ensuring your own comfort in your golden years. It's really a win-win situation when you look at it objectively." The room fell silent, except for the ticking of the old grandfather clock that Margaret's mother had given her as a wedding gift 40 years ago. Margaret looked around the room, at the family photos covering every surface, at the handmade curtains she had sewn when money was tight, at the scuff marks on the hardwood floor where David had learned to ride his bike during a particularly harsh winter. Every corner of this house held a memory. Every room told the story of a woman who had sacrificed everything to build a life for her. "Ungrateful son. You know," Margaret said slowly, rising from her chair with a dignity that made both David and Sarah suddenly uncomfortable. "When your father left us, David, I could have given up. I could have put you in foster care and moved back with my parents, but I didn't. I worked 16-hour days. I ate peanut butter sandwiches for dinner so you could have proper meals. I wore the same 3 dresses for 5 years so you could have new clothes for school. I never went on vacations, never bought myself anything nice, never even went out on a date, because every penny, every moment of my life was devoted to making sure you had every opportunity to succeed." David finally looked up at his mother, and for just a moment, Margaret saw a flicker of the little boy who used to crawl into her bed during thunderstorms. But Sarah's sharp elbow to his ribs quickly reminded him of his priorities. "Mom, that's all in the past," he said, his voice cold once again. "We're talking about your future now. You can't live in this old house forever, and Sarah and I need to think about our own family's needs. You raised me to be practical and successful, so you should be proud that I'm making smart business decisions." Margaret walked to the mantelpiece and picked up a framed photograph of David's law school graduation. In the picture, she was beaming with pride, wearing her best dress and shoes that she had saved for months to buy, standing next to her son, who was wearing the cap and gown that she had worked double shifts to pay for. "Smart business decisions," she repeated, setting the frame down with deliberate care. "Is that what you call asking your mother to give up her home so you can buy a bigger one? Is that the kind of lawyer you've become, David? The kind of man?" Sarah stood up abruptly, her patience clearly exhausted. "Look, Margaret, we're trying to be nice about this, but let's be realistic. You're 68 years old, living alone in a house that's too big. For you, in a neighborhood that's clearly declining. David has responsibilities now, real responsibilities, and he can't be expected to support you forever. Selling this house and moving somewhere more appropriate is the sensible thing to do. And if you truly love your son, you'll do what's best for his future. The words hung in the air like poison gas, and Margaret felt something inside her chest crack and then shatter completely. Support her. She had never asked David for a single penny since. He graduated from college. She had paid for his law school with money she borrowed against the house. Money she was still paying back when he got his first high-paying job. She had babied and coddled and sacrificed for this man who was now sitting in her living room, in the house she had nearly killed herself to keep, demanding that she give up everything so he could have more. Margaret walked slowly back to her chair and sat down, her hands folded calmly in her lap. When she spoke, her voice was steady and clear, with an undertone of steel that neither David nor Sarah had ever heard before. You know what? You're absolutely right. It is time for me to make some changes in my life. It's time for me to stop living in the past and start thinking about my future practically. David and Sarah exchanged triumphant glances, clearly believing they had won. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to sell the house, just like you suggested. Before I continue with Margaret's story, I want to pause here for just a moment and talk to you, my dear friends. How many of you watching right now have ever felt unappreciated by the very people you've sacrificed everything for? How many of you have given and given until you had nothing left, only to be treated as if your contributions didn't matter? If you're nodding along, if this story is touching something deep in your heart, I want you to know that you're not alone. We're building a community here of people who understand what it means to love deeply, to sacrifice willingly, and sometimes to be hurt by those we love most. Please, take a moment to subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell, because we're here to remind each other that our worth isn't determined by how others treat us. And I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever been in Margaret's shoes? David practically jumped out of his chair with excitement, his face lighting up with a greed that made Margaret's stomach turn. Really, Mom? You'll do it? That's fantastic. Sarah and I have already looked into some really nice places for you. There's this wonderful senior community about an hour away from here, and they have bingo nights and craft classes. You'll love it there. He was already reaching for his phone, probably to call his real estate agent friend, when Margaret held up her hand to stop him. Wait, David, I'm not finished explaining my decision, Margaret said, her voice carrying a calm authority that seemed to surprise her son. Sarah was already calculating numbers in her head, probably figuring out how much money they would have for their dream house after paying for Margaret's accommodation. But Margaret's next words would shatter their greedy little fantasy into a million pieces. You see, you're right that I need to think practically about my future. And practically speaking, I've realized that I've been far too generous with my resources for far too long. Margaret stood up and walked to the old secretary desk in the corner, the same desk where she had balanced her checkbook every month, stretching every dollar to make ends meet while David was growing up. She pulled out a folder that she had been keeping there, a folder that contained documents David and Sarah knew nothing about. Did you know, David, that 3 years ago, when you bought your house, you asked me to co-sign your mortgage because Sarah's credit wasn't quite good enough, and your income, while impressive, wasn't quite sufficient for the loan you wanted? David's face went pale. He had conveniently forgotten about that little detail, hoping his mother would never bring it up in front of Sarah, who believed her husband had qualified for their mortgage entirely on his own merits. Sarah turned to stare at David with an expression that could have frozen fire. What is she talking about, David? You told me your credit was excellent. You told me we qualified easily. It was just a formality, Sarah, David stammered, loosening his tie as beads of sweat began forming on his forehead. Banks require co-signers sometimes, even for people with good credit. It didn't mean anything. But Margaret was just getting started, and the folder in her hands contained more surprises than her ungrateful son could have imagined. And then there was your car, David, that beautiful BMW sitting in my driveway right now. Do you remember how you got that car? Margaret's voice was steady, almost conversational, but There was steel underneath that made both David and Sarah shift uncomfortably in their seats. "You see, Sarah, your husband came to me 2 years ago, explaining that his old car was embarrassing him in front of clients and that he needed something more prestigious to maintain his professional image. He asked me to take out a loan against my house to help with the down payment." Sarah's mouth fell open as she turned to stare at her husband. "You borrowed money from your mother to buy your car?" "David, how could you not tell me this? My parents think you're so successful and independent." David was now sweating profusely, realizing that his carefully constructed image was crumbling before his eyes. "Sarah, listen. I can explain everything. These were just temporary arrangements, business decisions that any smart person would make." Margaret opened the folder and pulled out several documents, spreading them carefully on the coffee table like a lawyer presenting evidence in court. "Temporary arrangements. That's an interesting way to put it, David. Because according to these documents, you still owe me $47,000 for the car loan, plus the money I lent you for Sarah's engagement ring, plus the money I gave you for your honeymoon, plus the money I sent you last Christmas when you said you were having cash flow problems at work." The room was so quiet that Margaret could hear her own heartbeat. Sarah was staring at the documents as if they were written in a foreign language, while David looked like a man watching his entire world collapse in slow motion. $63,000, Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "That's what you owe me, David. Money I borrowed against this house, money I'm still paying interest on every month, money that comes out of my Social Security check, and the small pension I get from 30 years of cleaning office buildings." Sarah finally found her voice, and when she spoke, it was with a fury that made the temperature in the room seem to drop 10 degrees. "David Walter Morrison, are you telling me that we've been living on borrowed money from your mother? Are you telling me that everything we have, everything I thought we had achieved together, is built on debt to a woman you just asked to sell her house to give us more money?" The use of David's full name, including the middle name he hated, told Margaret that Sarah was beyond angry. She was humiliated, and there was nothing more dangerous than a proud woman who had just discovered she wasn't as successful as she thought she was. David tried to salvage the situation, but he was drowning in his own lies and deceptions. "Sarah, honey, please listen. Every successful person leverages resources. I was going to pay Mom back as soon as we got the money from selling this house. It was all part of a bigger financial strategy." But Sarah was no longer listening to her husband. She was staring at Margaret with a mixture of shock and something that might have been newfound respect. "Mrs. Morrison," Sarah said, her voice completely different now, stripped of its earlier condescension, "I had no idea about any of this. David told me that your financial situation was, well, that you needed our help. He said you were struggling to maintain this house and that moving to a senior community would be better for everyone involved." Margaret looked at her daughter-in-law with sad understanding. Sarah had been manipulated just as much as Margaret had been, fed lies about Margaret's situation to justify their greed. Margaret sat back down in her chair, suddenly feeling every one of her 68 years. "Sarah, I own this house free and clear as of last month. I have savings, a pension, and Social Security. I'm not wealthy, but I'm comfortable. What I am is tired. Tired of being treated like a burden by the son I nearly killed myself to raise. Tired of being asked to give more and more while receiving less and less respect in return." She looked directly at David, who couldn't meet her eyes. "And I'm especially tired of being lied to and manipulated by someone I love more than my own life." David finally looked up at his mother, and for the first time that evening, his expression showed genuine remorse rather than calculated concern. "Mom, I never meant for things to get so complicated. I was just trying to build a good life for Sarah and me, and I thought you would want to help us succeed." His voice was small now, like the little boy who used to apologize for breaking her favorite vase. "Help you succeed?" Margaret's voice rose for the first time that evening. "David, I have been helping you succeed your entire life. I worked myself to the bone to pay for your education. I gave you every opportunity I never had, and I continued to support you financially even after you became a successful lawyer. But apparently, all of that help wasn't enough. You needed more. You needed my house, my security, my final sanctuary, because your success wasn't built on your own merit, but on your mother's sacrifice. Margaret stood up once again, but this time her movements were deliberate and purposeful. She walked to the window and looked out at the garden she had tended for 37 years, at the oak tree David used to climb as a boy, at the driveway where she had taught him to drive her old Honda when he was 16. Every inch of this property held memories, but more than that, it represented something that David and Sarah would never understand, the security that comes from having something that truly belongs to you, something you've earned through your own sweat and sacrifice. "You want me to sell this house," Margaret said, her back still turned to them, her voice carrying across the room with startling clarity. "You want me to uproot my entire life, abandon the only home I've ever truly owned, and move into some sterile facility where I'll be surrounded by strangers, all so you can have more money to buy more things you can't actually afford." She turned around to face them, and both David and Sarah were struck by the transformation in her appearance. Gone was the apologetic, eager-to-please mother they had walked in on. In her place stood a woman who looked like she had finally remembered her own worth. "Well, you know what? I'm going to do exactly what you asked. I'm going to sell this house." David started to smile, but Margaret wasn't finished. "But I'm not going to give you the money, not one penny of it. You see, David, you just taught me a very valuable lesson about family, about respect, and about knowing when someone is taking advantage of your love. So I'm going to sell this house, and I'm going to take every dollar from that sale, plus the $63,000 you owe me, and I'm going to start living the life I should have been living all along." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah looked confused, as if she couldn't quite process what she was hearing, while David appeared to be having some kind of mathematical breakdown, trying to calculate how much money he was about to lose. "Mom, you can't be serious," he finally managed to say. "We're family. We're supposed to help each other. You can't just abandon your own son when he needs you." Margaret's laugh was bitter and sharp. "Abandon you? David, I haven't abandoned you. You abandoned me the moment you decided that my love was something you could exploit rather than cherish. You abandoned me when you lied to me about your financial situation. You abandoned me when you convinced your wife that I was a burden instead of the woman who made your success possible. And you abandoned me tonight when you sat in my living room and demanded that I give up my home so you could have more money." Sarah, who had been uncharacteristically quiet during this exchange, suddenly spoke up. "Margaret, I think there's been a huge misunderstanding here. If I had known about David's debts to you, about how much you've already done for us, I never would have agreed to this conversation. I thought, David told me you were struggling financially and that selling the house was as much for your benefit as ours." She glared at her husband with an expression that promised a very unpleasant conversation once they got home. "Sarah, I appreciate that," Margaret said, her tone softening slightly. "But the damage is done. Tonight, I learned that my own son sees me not as his mother, but as a source of funding for his lifestyle. He sees this house not as my home, but as his inheritance that he's tired of waiting for. And most heartbreaking of all, I learned that everything I thought I had accomplished as a mother, all the values I thought I had instilled in him, were apparently meaningless when faced with the opportunity for financial gain." Margaret walked over to the mantelpiece and picked up a small, framed photograph of herself and David from his high school graduation. In the picture, they were both beaming, his arm around her shoulders, her face glowing with pride and love. "I used to look at this picture and feel so proud," she said softly. "I thought I had raised a man of character, someone who understood the value of hard work and integrity. But tonight, I'm looking at this picture and wondering where I went wrong." David finally broke down, tears streaming down his face as the full weight of what he had done hit him. "Mom, please. I'm sorry. I know I messed up. I know I've been selfish and greedy, but please don't give up on me. I can change. I can be better. Just give me another chance." His voice was desperate now, the voice of a man who had just realized he was about to lose the most important person in his life. Margaret looked at her son, and for a moment, her resolve wavered. This was her baby, the little boy she had rocked to sleep, the teenager she had stayed up all night helping with homework, the young man she had cheered for at his graduation. But then she remembered the cold calculation in his eyes when he had demanded she sell her house, the casual way he had dismissed her feelings, the lies he had told about her to justify his greed. "David, I will always love you," she said quietly. "You are my son, and nothing will ever change that. But love doesn't mean enabling someone's selfishness. Love doesn't mean sacrificing yourself so someone else can avoid the consequences of their choices. Real love sometimes means stepping back and letting someone learn from their mistakes, even when it breaks your heart to do it." She walked to the front door and opened it, the cool evening air rushing into the warm house. "I think it's time for you both to leave now. I have a lot of planning to do. I need to call a real estate agent, start looking at condos in Florida, maybe book that cruise I've been dreaming about for 20 years, but never took because I was always sending money to help my son instead." Her voice was steady, but David could see the tears in her eyes, tears that made his own guilt even more unbearable. As David and Sarah gathered their things and headed toward the door, Margaret made one final statement that would haunt her son for years to come. "You know, David, the saddest part about tonight isn't that you asked me to sell my house. It's that you never once asked if I wanted to sell it. You never considered that this place might mean something to me beyond its monetary value. You treated me like a business transaction instead of your mother, and that's something I don't think I can ever forgive or forget." David paused in the doorway, looking back at his mother one last time. "Mom, please, don't do this. Don't throw away our relationship over money. We can work this out." But Margaret's expression was resolute, and she spoke with a finality that chilled him to the bone. "I'm not throwing away our relationship, David. You already did that. I'm just finally accepting it." The next morning, Margaret woke up with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. The house seemed different somehow, lighter, as if the weight of false obligations and manipulative expectations had been lifted from its walls. She made her coffee, sat at her kitchen table, and pulled out the phone book to look up real estate agents. But before she made that call, she had something else to do. Something that would ensure David learned the full consequences of treating his mother like a business opportunity rather than a human being. Margaret dialed the number for David's law firm, asking to speak with the senior partner, Mr. Harrison, a man she had met several times at David's office parties over the years. "Mr. Harrison, this is Margaret Morrison, David's mother. I hope you don't mind me calling, but I have a rather delicate financial matter to discuss with you." The conversation that followed was brief but illuminating. Margaret explained that her son owed her a substantial amount of money that had been borrowed against her home, money she would need repaid immediately as she was planning to relocate. "Mrs. Morrison," Mr. Harrison said carefully, "I had no idea David was carrying personal debt of that magnitude. This could potentially affect his security clearance for some of our government contracts. I think it would be best if he came in to discuss this matter with me as soon as possible." Margaret smiled grimly as she hung up the phone. David had always been so proud of his high security clearance, the thing that made him valuable to his firm and justified his high salary. Now he would have to explain to his boss why he had hidden substantial personal debt that could be seen as a security risk. Her next call was to David and Sarah's mortgage company. As a co-signer on their loan, Margaret had certain rights, including the right to be informed about the loan status and the right to request immediate repayment if she felt the borrowers were in financial distress. "I'd like to discuss the possibility of removing myself as co-signer from my son's mortgage," she told the loan officer. "I'm concerned about his ability to meet his obligations given some recent financial revelations." The loan officer explained that removing a co-signer typically required either refinancing the loan or proving that the primary borrowers could qualify for the mortgage on their own, without the co-signer's income and credit history. Given that David and Sarah had needed Margaret's co-signature in the first place, this would likely prove impossible, especially now that David's employer was aware of his financial difficulties. Margaret thanked the loan officer and hung up, satisfied that David was about to learn some very expensive lessons about fiscal responsibility. By noon, Margaret had appointments scheduled with 3 different real estate agents for the following week. She had also called a travel agent and booked a consultation to discuss extended travel options, including that Mediterranean cruise she had been dreaming about for decades. She had contacted a financial advisor to help her invest the money from her home sale wisely, and she had even called the local animal shelter to inquire about volunteer opportunities in Florida, where she was considering relocating. Her phone rang constantly throughout the day. David called 17 times, leaving increasingly frantic voicemails. Sarah called twice, her voice much more respectful than it had ever been, asking if they could please sit down and discuss the situation like adults. David's boss called once, asking Margaret to come in and discuss the financial situation in more detail. Even David's father, who hadn't spoken to Margaret in 15 years, somehow got word of the situation and called to tell her she was being unnecessarily harsh on their son. Margaret answered none of these calls. She was too busy planning the life she should have been living all along, the life she had postponed and sacrificed for a son who had repaid her generosity with manipulation and disrespect. She spent the afternoon going through old photo albums, not with sadness, but with a kind of archaeological interest, trying to pinpoint exactly when David had stopped seeing her as his mother and started seeing her as his personal ATM. That evening, as Margaret was enjoying a glass of wine and a book on her back porch, she heard a car pull into her driveway. Through the window, she saw David getting out of a taxi rather than his usual BMW. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his hair was disheveled, and he looked like a man who had spent the day being systematically destroyed by the consequences of his own actions. David knocked on the door, but Margaret didn't answer. He knocked again, then began pleading through the door. "Mom, please, I know you're in there. I need to talk to you. Everything is falling apart. Mr. Harrison put me on probation at work. The mortgage company wants to meet with me and Sarah tomorrow. Sarah is talking about staying at her parents' house until we figure this out. Please, Mom, I'm begging you. I need help." Margaret set down her book and walked to the door, but she didn't open it. Instead, she spoke through the solid wood barrier that now seemed to represent the wall David had built between them with his selfishness and lies. "David, what you need isn't help. What you need is to learn how to solve your own problems, without expecting your mother to bail you out. What you need is to understand that actions have consequences, and that treating people badly has a price." "But Mom," David's voice was breaking now, "I could lose everything. My job, my house, my marriage. Sarah's parents are furious. They're talking about helping her file for divorce. I could end up with nothing." Margaret felt a familiar tug at her heartstrings, the motherly instinct to protect and fix and make everything better for her child. But this time, she recognized that instinct for what it was, the very weakness that had enabled David's selfish behavior for years. "David," she said firmly, "you should have thought about losing everything before you decided to treat your mother like a business transaction. You should have considered the consequences before you lied to your wife about where your money was coming from. You should have thought about your marriage before you decided that your mother's home was just another asset you could liquidate for your benefit." There was a long silence, and Margaret thought David might have left. But then she heard him slide down against the door, sitting on her front porch like he used to do as a child when he was in trouble and trying to avoid punishment. "I don't know how to fix this, Mom," he said quietly. "I don't know how to be the man you raised me to be. Somewhere along the way, I became someone I don't recognize, someone who could look his own mother in the eye and ask her to give up her home for his benefit." For the first time since their confrontation began, Margaret heard something in David's voice that gave her a tiny spark of hope. Genuine remorse, not just panic about the consequences he was facing. "David," she said softly, "the man I raised wouldn't have asked his mother to sacrifice her security for his comfort. The man I raised would have figured out a way to solve his own problems. The man I raised would have honored his debts and treated his family with respect." My dear friends, I want to pause here again because I know many of you are feeling the same heartbreak that Margaret is experiencing right now. Sometimes the people we love most force us to make impossible choices between enabling their behavior and protecting ourselves. If you've ever been in a situation where you had to choose between helping someone you love and maintaining your own dignity, you know how painful this moment is. I hope you'll continue to be part of our community by subscribing and sharing your own stories in the comments. Have you ever had to set boundaries with family members who were taking advantage of your love? Your experiences could help others who are facing similar situations. Margaret felt the weight of the words she was about to speak, each syllable laden with decades of misdirected love and lessons she had failed to teach. The morning breeze blew gently through the leaves of the oak tree she had planted when David was only 5 years old, and she remembered how he used to climb that tree, always confident that she would be there below to catch his fall. Now, at 52, he still expected her to be there to catch his financial and emotional falls. "David, when you were little, I promised your father that I would be both mother and father to you after he died," she began, her voice trembling slightly with the memory of the man she had lost so many years ago. "I thought that meant protecting you from any hardship, any consequences, any pain. I was wrong. What I really should have done was teach you to be strong enough to face life on your own." David remained silent, but Margaret could see tears forming in his eyes again. She continued, determined to say everything she had kept in her heart for so long. "Remember when you were 16 and crashed the car? Instead of making you work to pay for the damages, I simply paid for everything and bought you a new car. When you went to college and spent all your tuition money on a trip to the Bahamas with your friends, I took out a loan to cover the expenses. When you graduated from law school and couldn't pass the bar exam on your first try, I paid for an expensive prep course instead of letting you figure out how to get the money yourself." The silence between them was heavy, filled only by the sound of birds singing in the trees around the house, where Margaret had raised her son alone. She looked at his hands, noticing how they were still soft, unmarked by hard work or real sacrifices. Her own hands, on the other hand, told the story of decades of working double shifts, sleepless nights worrying about bills, sacrifices she had made without thinking twice. "The truth is that I raised a man who believes he deserves to be rescued whenever he makes bad decisions," she said, feeling each word like a weight being lifted from her shoulders. "When you came here last night demanding that I sell my house, you weren't asking for emergency help. You were simply assuming that I would sacrifice my security for your mistakes, as I always have. And for the first time in my life, I said no." David finally raised his head, his tear-reddened eyes meeting hers. "Mom, I know I've made mistakes, many mistakes, but I didn't know what else to do. I'm desperate, and that's exactly where you need to be," Margaret replied, surprising herself with the firmness of her own voice. Desperation is what makes people find real solutions instead of looking for someone to solve their problems. "You're 42 years old, David. You're a law school graduate, intelligent and capable. The fact that you're in financial trouble isn't bad luck. It's the result of choices you made consciously and deliberately." She got up from the swing and walked to the porch, leaning against the railing she had painted herself last spring. "Last night, after you left, I stayed awake all night thinking about our conversation, and I realized something important. I wasn't helping you all these years. I was hurting you. Every time I solved your problems, I was sending the message that you weren't capable of solving them yourself. But I'm your son," David said, his voice broken. "Isn't that what mothers do? Help their children?" Margaret turned to face him, and for a moment, she saw not the grown man he was, but the 7-year-old boy who had cried in her arms when he learned that his father would never come home again. Helping and enabling are different things. "David, helping means giving someone the tools and knowledge to solve their own problems. Enabling means solving the problems for them, leaving them dependent and unable to grow." The wind changed direction, bringing with it the scent of the roses Margaret had planted in memory of her husband. She took a deep breath, drawing strength from memories of how he had always insisted that discipline was an act of love. "Your father used to say that the greatest gift we could give you would be the ability to support yourself and be happy without depending on us. I failed miserably at that mission. So, what do I do now?" David asked, his voice laden with a vulnerability Margaret hadn't heard in years. "Now you do what any responsible adult would do. You examine your finances honestly, cut unnecessary expenses, maybe sell some of the luxury items you bought when you couldn't afford them. You talk to a financial advisor, negotiate with your creditors, and possibly accept that you'll have to Change your lifestyle to something more modest and sustainable. Margaret returned to the swing and sat down again beside her son. And most importantly, you stop looking for someone to blame or someone to save you. You take full responsibility for the choices you made and work to correct them, no matter how long it takes or how difficult it may be. David was silent for a long moment, absorbing his mother's words. Finally, he said, "What if I can't do it? What if I fail completely?" "Then you'll fail," Margaret replied simply. "And then you'll get back up, learn from your mistakes, and try again." That's what responsible people do. They fail, learn, grow, and keep trying. But for the first time in your life, you'll do it alone, like the adult you should have become long ago.